In the quiet hours of the morning, when the palace still slept and the air was heavy with incense and candle smoke, the walls carried more than gilded ornaments. They echoed with hushed conversations, whispers, and broken fragments of secrets that seeped through layers of luxury and solemnity. Behind the carved doors of the Spanish Queen's chambers, a myth was being born. A myth that would become part of history. Even then, among marble and carpets, the palace was already turning into a stage, and at its center stood a young woman, draped in power, but stripped of the invisible shield that protects rulers from temptation. She did not yet know she would become a symbol not only of might, but also of disgrace. Yet in every glance, every step, every fleeting smile, there was already a shadow of the storms to come. 19th century Spain was a land of contradictions. Exhausted by wars and crises, the nation desperately craved a symbol of strength and stability. But it was on the throne itself, in the very heart of Madrid, that weakness took root. Weakness that would cost the country dearly. The royal apartments, with their golden frames, tapestries, and mirrors, became a reflection of the age itself, outwardly dazzling and grand, but inside restless, hungry for recognition, and consumed by pleasures that could not be hidden. Each time laughter echoed behind heavy doors, each time the steps of servants paused at unusual sounds, new stories were born. Courtiers carried them into rumors, and soon those whispers spread through the streets, into cafes, across foreign capitals. The brighter the crown shone, the louder the murmurs grew. And in this chorus of voices, a legend was taking shape. The story of a woman who turned her private desires into the spectacle of a court, and eventually of Europe itself. But before the world knew her as a queen of scandals and favorites, she was only a child, destined to grow up beneath the crushing weight of a crown too large for her head. To understand how the palace became the stage for endless dramas, we must return to the very beginning of her story. The birth of a girl bound to a destiny no one was ready for. October 1830. On a cool Madrid morning, a baby girl was born, a child who instantly became a disappointment. Spain had been waiting for a male heir who could secure the dynasty's survival. Fate decided otherwise. Isabella entered the world not only into a royal family, but into a time when the throne itself stood on shaky ground. Her father, King Ferdinand VII, desperate for an heir, had endured 4 marriages only to receive this fragile daughter. Her birth was greeted with polite smiles that barely masked the unease and disappointment of the court. From her very first days, Isabella's life was wrapped in expectations and intrigue. Her mother, Maria Cristina of Bourbon Two Sicilies, was forced to play 2 roles at once, a mother and the guardian of power. To her, Isabella was not only a child, but the key to holding the throne. And while she was learning her first words, battles for Spain's future were already raging behind her back. In 1833, when Ferdinand VII died, Isabella was only 3 years old. Her childhood ended in that moment. She was immediately proclaimed queen, and her mother assumed the role of regent. That same year, the First Carlist War began. Isabella's uncle Carlos claimed the throne for himself. The nation split in 2. For 7 years, Spain drowned in blood and terror, and through it all, the little queen was guarded by armed men who protected not only her life, but the very idea of her reign. Instead of toys, Isabella grew up surrounded by maps of military campaigns, officers' debates, and ministers' furious arguments. From her earliest years, she was taught that she was the center of the universe, that every gesture mattered, that every wish must be granted, even if blood had to be spilled for it. This education gave her not pride, but a dangerous sense of boundlessness. One more factor left its mark: the atmosphere of the court.
where adults spoke freely in front of the child, never caring what she understood. Rumors, intimate confessions, whispered affairs, these were part of her daily surroundings. She absorbed what should have been hidden. Slowly, she came to see power and private life alike as a stage, always meant for public view. After Ferdinand's death and the start of her mother's regency, the palace grew even more tense. Spain sank into chaos. One side fought for Isabella, the other rallied behind her uncle Carlos. For the child, this meant a life under constant guard, wrapped in an ever-present sense of danger. Each morning in the palace began with news of uprisings, defeats, and betrayals. The little queen grew up knowing that even a careless word could spark another outbreak of war. The servants and ministers around her were not gentle mentors, but ambitious players fighting for proximity to power. To them, Isabella was not a child, but a symbol. She was carried in arms not out of love, but out of calculation. Gradually, she grew accustomed to the idea that her very existence was a tool to influence others. She learned early to read moods, tones, and hidden hints. In her young mind, a conviction took root. Power was not responsibility, but the freedom to dictate the rules of the game. Whatever she desired should be hers, and whoever opposed her was an enemy. The war outside the palace walls created an atmosphere of permanent paranoia. Her mother, the regent, was too consumed with politics and her own survival to raise her daughter. Instead, it was the men of the court who filled the silence, speaking of power and duty in the same breath as desire and temptation. Surrounded by such suggestions, Isabella grew up in a world where boundaries blurred, and in her mind, authority was forever entangled with personal allure. By the end of the First Carlist War, Spain had changed, and so had Isabella herself. The child who was once meant to embody hope was becoming a young woman filled with a sense of her own grandeur and a hunger for attention that could never be satisfied. At 12, she already saw herself as mistress of the world, and she believed it only natural that this world should bend to her will. That sense of boundless entitlement became the prologue to her early entry into power, a decision that would shape not only her destiny, but that of the entire nation. In 1843, at just 13 years old, Isabella was declared of age. The move, born of political calculation, was meant to end Maria Christina's regency and stabilize the country. Instead, it placed a volatile teenager at the head of a fragile kingdom. In a single day, a girl accustomed to luxury and attention suddenly found herself holding absolute power over millions.
The paradox was striking. Physically, she appeared older than her years, and those around her eagerly played into that illusion. Courtiers treated her not as a child, but as a woman, free to do whatever she pleased. It created a false impression of maturity, while in truth, she remained a teenager, more vulnerable to influence than ever. The first months of her reign revealed what lay ahead. Her interest was drawn less to government papers or ministers' advice, and more to the generals, officers, and elder courtiers who filled her orbit. She learned to rule not through laws or reforms, but through a smile, a glance, a passing word. Whispers about her fascination with men spread faster than news of government meetings. To European diplomats, the young queen seemed not a reformer in the making, but a mystery in which the personal and the political were dangerously intertwined.
Her marriage became the most pressing concern. Traditionally, royal unions strengthened a nation's standing, but in Isabella's case, discussions turned less on diplomacy and more on whether any husband could manage her temperament and her growing passions. Ministers and ambassadors spoke of her not as a ruler, but as a young woman whose desires could shift the map of Europe.
By 14, she was openly flirting with powerful men at court. Hardened generals blushed under her gaze, and court ladies watched in horror as the teenager behaved as though her heart and her throne were inseparable. Already, the seeds of disaster were clear. For Isabella, there would be no boundaries between private life and state affairs. At that moment, Spain still believed its young queen could embody a new era, but her first steps made it clear the nation would not see renewal, but a series of trials in which power would mirror her most personal, unpredictable impulses. In 1846, Isabella was 16. Europe watched her closely, for her marriage would affect dynastic alliances and the balance of power across the continent. Pressured by foreign courts, Spanish ministers chose her cousin, Francisco de Asís, Duke of Cadiz. On paper, the match seemed sensible, a union within the dynasty, preserving legitimacy, avoiding risk to the crown. But in reality, it marked the beginning of both a personal tragedy and a political blunder.
Francisco was gentle, withdrawn, devoted to music, traits that clashed sharply with Isabella's energy and impulsiveness. She expected not only a political partner, but someone who could meet her emotional needs and accept her dominance. Yet on their very wedding night, it became clear the union lacked harmony. Awkwardness, coldness, and a complete absence of connection left her humiliated, a bitter shock for a girl used to getting everything she desired. The disappointment scarred her deeply. In her eyes, her husband was not a partner, but an obstacle. Instead of calming her fiery nature, the marriage fueled her defiance. In private, distance and estrangement prevailed, and soon the entire court was whispering about it. Servants carried tales, Europe mocked the farce, and Isabella herself felt deceived and insulted. Raised in an environment where nothing was ever left unsaid, Isabella saw no reason to keep her marriage troubles secret. She refused to play the role of submissive wife. Her behavior became a statement. Smiles for other men, deliberate gestures, fleeting touches noticed by everyone around her. Diplomats reported that the marriage was unlikely to preserve the dynasty's dignity. And indeed, rather than strengthening the monarchy, it shook its very foundations.
The palace, instead of enjoying stability, became a nest of contradictions. Francisco withdrew into himself, wounded but trapped, for his position depended on the marriage. Isabella, meanwhile, realized that in this failed union lay her freedom to make her own choices. If her husband could not give her what she craved, she would take it elsewhere, and soon the court would see how. Thus began a chain of events that turned the royal chambers into the center of endless stories, where the personal and the political twisted together into a knot that threatened the very order of the state. Disillusioned by marriage and stung by humiliation, Isabella wasted no time in seeking comfort beyond the marital bed. The first to step into her orbit was a young officer of the royal guard, José María González, known at court as Pepe Alcañices. Handsome, vigorous, with the rough charm of someone from a modest background, he stood in sharp contrast to the delicate yet powerless Francisco. What began as a passing infatuation quickly grew into an open affair. Alcañices was not only a constant presence in the Queen's chambers, but also appeared beside her at official ceremonies. Some admired his bold position, while others were outraged. Spain began to whisper that the Queen no longer even bothered to keep up appearances. Isabella's generosity toward her new favorite knew no bounds. He rose swiftly through the military ranks,
collecting titles and honors once reserved for the oldest noble families. Gifts rained upon him: estates, jewels, fortunes equal to the budgets of entire towns. This display of extravagance turned a private passion into a public scandal. But the worst damage came not from the money. The court saw alcañices entering and leaving the queen's rooms at all hours. He might sit beside her at the theater in the evening and be seen in her private apartments the next morning. Even foreign diplomats, seasoned in court gossip, wrote in their reports that such brazenness shocked and degraded the monarchy itself. The scandal deepened when Isabella bore children whose features raised more questions than answers. By law, they were Francisco's, but no one believed the fiction. Alcañizes's likeness was too obvious, and with it, the last shreds of confidence in the crown began to unravel. The affair lasted for years, but as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Isabella's passion cooled, leaving no trace of what once consumed her. Alcañices was reassigned to distant posts and eventually banished from Spain altogether. He received a generous pension, but the splendor of his life vanished. For him, it was a bitter defeat. For the queen, it was nothing more than a routine gesture. She had the power to elevate and just as easily to discard. The court understood. One favorite would soon be replaced by another, louder and more dangerous to the monarchy's reputation. When the Alcañices chapter closed, courtiers hoped Isabella might learn caution. They were wrong. The soldier was replaced by an artist, an Italian tenor, Carlo Marfori, whose looks and voice captivated the queen the moment he appeared in Madrid. His arrival in Madrid in 1851 caused a sensation, but no one expected him to become not merely a stage star, but the new master of the queen's heart.
Marfori was married with children, which only added fuel to the scandal. Isabella cared nothing for propriety. On the contrary, she flaunted her feelings. She attended every performance, always occupying the royal box alone, applauding louder than anyone, unable to hide her delight. After the curtain fell, the singer was brought, sometimes discreetly, sometimes openly, into the palace, where he remained until morning. The entire court knew the opera singer was now the queen's favorite. Even Francisco had no choice but to endure the humiliation. The queen poured staggering sums from the treasury into her lover's glory. She ordered a private theater built within the palace, summoned Europe's finest musicians, and purchased lavish sets and costumes, all to make Marfori shine. This extravagance unfolded against the backdrop of Spain's financial troubles, when ordinary people suffered under crushing taxes and food shortages. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The people starved, while the queen's chosen singer amassed titles, lands, and riches. Marfori was made Marquis of Loja, granted estates in Andalusia, and enjoyed privileges old noble families could only dream of. The Spanish aristocracy seethed with resentment. A foreigner, an actor, elevated above them solely by the queen's passion. But with these honors came jealousy and obsession. Isabella could not bear even a hint of his attention to other women. A letter from his wife was enough to ignite her fury, leading to screaming arguments and threats in full view of the court. These scenes became notorious, and the image of a love-struck queen chained to her dependent favorite became a symbol of the monarchy's disgrace. For 5 years, Marfori held her heart, gathering immense wealth. But, as before, it ended abruptly. In 1856, Isabella grew cold and ordered him to leave Spain at once. His resistance meant nothing. He was escorted under guard across the border, forbidden ever to return. Marfori was gone, but he left behind a dangerous precedent. Isabella's taste for favorites was no longer just a matter of personal scandal. It was beginning to shape politics itself.
The next chapter would push her passions beyond private gossip and turn them into a weapon of power. The arrival of General Enrique Puigmalto marked a turning point. Unlike her previous companions, he wanted more than wealth and titles. He saw in his intimacy with the queen an opportunity for real power. Ambitious, charismatic, a decorated officer, he quickly understood his alliance with Isabella could turn the bedroom into a council chamber. From then on, the palace was no longer merely a stage for the queen's whims. Puigmalto meddled in military appointments, promoted his allies, and pushed out his rivals, all through Isabella's trust, which allowed him more freedom than any minister. The army became a toy in the hands of a favorite.
But it did not stop there. The general began hosting gatherings inside the palace, evenings where other officers joined the queen as honored guests. These were carefully staged events: oriental carpets, music, lavish banquets. To Isabella, they were amusements. To Puigmalto, they were instruments of control. Those who attended these private soirees soon found themselves rewarded with posts and honors. The costs of such indulgence fell on the royal treasury, while soldiers in the colonies went without uniforms or weapons. Everyone knew it, and the rumors spread faster than official decrees. Even the clergy began to whisper that the crown had become a place where decisions were born not in council chambers, but in rooms of revelry. For Isabella, it was proof of her absolute power. She believed herself mistress not only of her country, but of the fates of all who entered her chambers. With Puigmalto, scandals stopped being whispered secrets and burst into the open. Pamphlets circulated through Madrid, mocking the queen's nightly adventures. They were copied by hand, sold in taverns, retold in marketplaces. The crown tried to suppress them, but the stream of ridicule could not be stopped. The palace became an arena of competition among favorites. Guardsmen, clerks, even actors rose from obscurity, transformed into counts or royal advisors simply by winning Isabella's favor. The old nobility lost ground, and their resentment deepened the rift. Servants and courtiers who had seen too much sold their stories for money. In these accounts, the palace looked less like a seat of government and more like a theater of whims. The louder the laughter in the cafes, the lower Spain's prestige fell abroad. Diplomats wrote home. The Spanish court resembled not a monarchy, but a cautionary tale of folly. The clergy, long the throne's most loyal ally, found itself paralyzed. How could it defend a monarch when each new rumor shredded its sermons on virtue? Even priests began to whisper that the crown had sunk into disgrace. The most destructive change, however, was this. The people now saw that power no longer bothered to hide its indulgences. Where once the crown carried a sacred aura, respect was now replaced with open contempt. Over time, Isabella's obsessions extended beyond people to objects. Her apartments became a museum of exotic treasures: oriental rugs, carved furniture from distant lands, rare incense, fabrics of impossible delicacy. Each new favorite demanded a different setting, and the palace reshaped itself accordingly. At times a theater stage, at times a perfumed boudoir, at times a hall of noisy revels, where music drowned out the ministers' voices. For her, it was entertainment. For Spain, it was ruin. The sums spent on such caprices could have armed regiments or fed entire provinces, yet Isabella drifted ever further from the affairs of state. Council meetings were postponed, receptions for foreign envoys delayed, while the queen concerned herself with dresses and perfumes.
Her entourage adapted. Every courtier knew by now that what mattered was not a political report, but the ability to amuse their mistress. And with each passing year, it became clearer. Spain lived at the mercy of one woman's whims, who preferred fantasy to reality. The common people noticed too. On the streets, when they spoke of taxes or the shortage of bread, someone always drew the same bitter comparison. The Queen inhales incense from India while we stand in line for flour. Such talk slowly but surely destroyed the last remnants of respect for the throne. By the mid-1850s, the change in Isabella was visible to all. Her face lost its freshness, her movements grew abrupt, her voice hoarse. Court doctors noted her fatigue, trembling hands, and violent mood swings. At times, she laughed for hours, hosting lavish receptions. At others, she fell into gloom, refusing to hear her ministers. Alcohol only worsened the instability. Decrees were issued in bursts of impulse, only to be revoked the next day. Ministers complained it was impossible to govern. Yesterday's law was void before the ink on the next was dry. To the court, it became routine. To Europe, it was a warning sign. Ambassadors reported home, "The Spanish queen is unpredictable. Her court resembles a chaotic circus." Thus, personal weakness became a national crisis. By the early 1860s, Spain's patience had run out. Discontent spread through the army. Respected generals refused to serve at a court where decisions hinged on the queen's moods and the whims of her favorites. Ancient noble families, loyal to the crown for centuries, now openly grumbled that their service meant nothing while chance companions held the reins of power. In Parliament and backroom corridors, ministers whispered the unthinkable, replacing Isabella. Even her allies could no longer excuse her actions. Across Europe, monarchs avoided Madrid, unwilling to be tied to her reputation. In the streets, satirical pamphlets appeared. Crowds laughed at caricatures showing the queen surrounded by lovers, with captions that read, "This is the face of Spain." Public contempt grew louder every day. The country waited for a spark, and in 1868 it came. In Cadiz, soldiers rose in rebellion, and the cry spread across the nation. Soldiers, politicians, and ordinary citizens united under a single slogan, "Down with the shameless one." It was a direct attack on the Queen's honor. Isabella tried to lean on those closest to her, elevating favorites to the rank of ministers and commanders. But instead of protecting her, it only quickened the collapse. Courtiers who knew nothing of war could not defend a kingdom.
Regiments defected to the revolution. Cities opened their gates to the rebels. In Madrid, the truth was undeniable. The throne was falling. Of hope found herself at the center of a storm of her own making. In the autumn of 1868, it was over. Isabella fled Madrid in haste, heading toward the French border. Her carriages rolled through streets filled not with grief, but with jeers and insults. The same people who once welcomed her as a symbol of renewal now hurled words of contempt. On her journey, the humiliation deepened. In small towns, crowds gathered only to show gestures of disdain. Abdication became fact. The throne stood empty, and Spain tasted freedom from scandalous rule. In France, Isabella settled in Paris. She could still live in luxury, funded by wealth carried out of Spain, but now it was not power, only a shadow of what once was. In exile, she refused to surrender. She plotted, negotiated with monarchists, appealed to foreign allies. Yet every attempt met the same wall: her name. Even those who wanted a monarchy back did not want her. Isabella had become the very symbol of disgrace. Meanwhile, Spain sought new paths. A foreign king was invited. Then came a brief republic, and later the restoration of the dynasty under her son, Alfonso XII.
Isabella herself remained on the sidelines, watching as her country moved forward without her. Every attempt to regain influence ended in silence or outright rejection. Politicians said it plainly: her presence would only reopen wounds and remind the nation of its darkest years. As the years passed, her life in France grew quieter. She settled into Parisian mansions, surrounded by memories and a handful of loyal servants. Outwardly, she kept her splendor: dresses, jewels, evenings with close friends. But it was all a mask. Inside, she was still the woman who had lost both her country and her people's respect. Even her children kept their distance. They knew her name was a curse, a burden in politics rather than an advantage. To Spain, she became a figure of the past, almost forgotten. In 1904, in Paris, her life ended. In Spain, the news passed almost unnoticed. Newspapers wrote briefly. The public showed no grief. So ended the life of a woman who once held a kingdom in her hands, but who had squandered it all for fleeting passions and the illusion of power. The story of Isabella, too, remains one of the bitterest warnings in Spanish monarchy. Her life showed how personal weakness can destroy an entire nation when placed in the hands of absolute power. From a child of hope, she became a symbol of disorder and scandal. Her reign shattered respect for the dynasty and left deep cracks in Spanish society. The revolution of 1868 was not merely a political coup. It was the moral bankruptcy of a figure meant to embody dignity and strength. Even today, her name endures as a warning. A throne without responsibility, power without restraint, personal whims raised above duty. Such a crown becomes a burden to an entire country, and Spain paid dearly for the illusions of one queen.